Hey folks in English 1301, this is the hopefully brief supplemental video for week number 3, just to kind of touch base on the ideas and information covered in the readings that were required last week, because those will have an impact on how we think about writing in the future. So I'm going to briefly talk about the chapter reading, which was What's Your Style, as well as Irvin's article, What is Academic Writing? So I'm going to pull those up, and again, we're just kind of covering this briefly. What I did want to note is that Lunsford in chapter 30 really talks about language and notes information about dialect, and she writes, but the fact that academic dialects of languages emerge and change over time, and that the appropriate use of a language most often depends on context, doesn't mean that stylistic choices are without any boundaries at all, right? So I want you to think about this, because especially with the example that Lunsford uses of Geneva Smitherman, who is a very well-known linguist and academic, there are choices to be made, right? In Talking and Testifying the Language of Black America, Smitherman notes that before about 1959, Black English had been primarily the interest of university academics, particularly the historical linguists and cultural anthropologists. She notes, but in recent years, the issue has become a very hot controversy, and there have been articles on Black dialect in the national press, as well as in the educational research literature. And she references the NAACP and the Black Panthers, and these highly publicized discussions and information that was swirling around regarding Black English or African American Vernacular English. It's known by several different names, but that's important because when we're thinking about style in our writing, in this class, you are welcome to use your style as long as it is serving a purpose, right? So if you are, usually speaking or thinking in another language, you can use that in your posts or in your writing, because I'm opening the kinds of boundaries for style in the writing, because I consider that all to be part of academic writing and how we write. So if you're bringing in some slang or some different language or things like that, as long as it's appropriate to what we're writing and talking about, and not just something that is lazy on your part in terms of writing, like, oh, I'm just writing in text speak, or oh, I'm just writing like I talk to my friends. As long as it serves a purpose, then style is a bit open for this course, but of course in a lot of college writing that may not be the case, and that's something that your professors will identify. And if they don't identify what their requirements on style may be, you should definitely ask them. That's your right as a student to know that, okay? So I'm going to scroll down because we're talking about and thinking about in this chapter some different terminology that's going to be really important, like audience, right? Finding common ground, right? When we think about writing. And the text does a really good job of kind of integrating ideas and images, because visual rhetoric is also something that's really impactful and has a purpose. When we talk about formality, there are different levels of formality, and they use a speech by John McCain, or a letter from former senator who's passed away, John McCain, as examples of, once you understand your rhetorical situation, that will definitely set those standards of formality or informality, as well as dialect or tone or style in general, right? So you just have to kind of read the room, but if your professors aren't giving you those expectations, then you absolutely should be asking them when it comes to writing, because like I said, it is your right to know these things as a student. And sometimes professors just make assumptions about what we know in terms of how we should be writing, okay? So always ask. Stance is also, taking a stance in writing becomes pretty important. But what I wanted to show, if I scroll down a little bit, I'm trying not to move too quickly to make you nauseous. So tone is something that I think is really key, especially because we're thinking about, we write in an online environment where we're not seeing each other's facial cues and those markers that we might see if we were face to face. So tone in our writing becomes even more important, right? So Lunsford notes that all the writing you do, regardless of stance or level of formality, has a particular tone. You may not think consciously about how to establish that tone, especially when commenting on a friend's Instagram post or responding in a discussion post of your class, right? But even in social media writing, you're making choices about whether you want to convey a serious tone, a humorous tone, an exasperated tone. And tone becomes really important again in online classes, because sometimes when we're responding to one another, we may be doing so quickly, right? So we're not thinking about how our tone is being read by somebody else. So our tone may read as dismissive or condescending or rude or whatever the case may be. So this is definitely a kind of class environment where we want to think about things such as tone, in addition to formality, rhetorical situations, audience, all of that kind of stuff, okay? Style across media, of course, media has various styles. When we think about Twitter, we think of different expectations than we might think for something like a Prezi presentation. There is reference to hashtag Black Lives Matter, talking about tweets and Facebook and how those things that are relevant, those stories and those like the murder of Trayvon Martin, those things are very relevant to our lives, especially now, have been historically, definitely. But media, you know, there are different style expectations when it comes to media. And the Black Lives Matter movement, especially using Twitter, has been really, really important, right? And then, of course, there are different styles across disciplines. So the style expectations in a course like this are very different from writing in like a biology class, right? Which means always that you should ask your professor if they are not setting the standards for what their expectations in writing are. Please make sure you're asking them, because it's going to be different in every class, okay? I'm going to bring up Irvin's article just because, in addition to the myths that he identifies that I think are really important because we need to recognize them as myths, he also has this kind of chart that helps us look at the academic writing, what he calls the academic writing situation, right? So we always want to think in academic writing about who's your audience, what's the occasion or context, what's your message, always what's your purpose, right? We always have a purpose in writing, so sometimes we need to make sure that's clear. And then what documents and genres are used, right? So in our spaces, you know, the audience may shift. You may be writing to one another because we're writing discussion posts. Ultimately, I am an audience member that you should be thinking of because I'm reading and grading your work, right? But also the occasion, you know, it's going to change. Context will change. The message will change. So we just have to be aware of these things and make sure we're asking those questions of our professors when necessary. I want to stop for just a second and note that the random word that I'm including in this supplemental video this week is unicorn. I don't know why, just cuz. But I also do, I'm going to scroll slowly. I want to go back to, this is such an important article for so many reasons. So make sure that you definitely read it and understand it. But I want to address the myths because I really do want to drive home the idea that these are myths. These are not actually ideas that we should continue thinking about. So the paint by numbers idea, we don't want to look at writing as we have to follow this certain set of steps, or that we have to follow these particular steps. Writing will always change and those steps may change. Yes, I as a writing instructor, I'm going to say, okay, first we need to do this, then we need to do this. But that doesn't mean that outside of what I'm asking you to do, you can't follow your own set of standards, right? You can write drafts on paper, you know, for your discussion posts, or you can write thought bubbles, or, you know, do whatever you need to do in order to convey your ideas as best you can in the discussion posts at the very least, right? Writers only start writing when they have everything figured out. This is a procrastinator's dream. So if you are feeling like this is a familiar one to you, sometimes it just means starting. Just start, okay, with writing. Because once you start, even if it's messy, even if it's ugly and it doesn't make sense, you can then revise it to make sense. You can then just get your ideas out and don't edit yourself. Don't stress, okay? Perfect first drafts. Y'all, perfect first drafts don't exist. The best writers that we know, any of the writers that we've learned about in school or we like, so some people love Stephen King, some people like, I love Toni Morrison and Octavia Butler and Gloria Anzaldúa. These are writers that I really respect who write beautifully, and it seems so effortless the way that they write, but that's not, it is an effort to write and to write well. Nobody writes a perfect first draft. Even the best writers we know, it takes practice, right? And that's what we do in this class. I always tell students, Beyonce didn't wake up one day and decide she wanted to be Beyonce, right? I love Beyonce. She practiced. She woke up every day and said, I'm going to go to dance class. I'm going to go to voice lessons. I'm going to do all of these things to then become this huge megastar, right? She did a lot of work to get there. She wasn't, she wasn't the superstar that we know now just because she just woke up one day and decided. It took practice. Some got it, I don't. The genius fallacy. People aren't born with different writing skills. Those people you look at and think, oh, they have that skill and I don't. Those are just people who likely had a lot more practice in their school environments, or they write a lot at home for different reasons, or they're in a household where writing is, taken to a different kind of level than others. Again, it's the practice. It's the more you dedicate your time to thinking about how you write and what you're writing, that's what matters, okay? Good grammar is good writing. This is just bull, right? I mean, yes, having good grammar would be amazing, awesome for all of us. But a lot of times we learn grammar in elementary school and then we don't ever talk about it or revisit it until now, when I'll say things like, oh, you need to avoid the passive voice, or we use this terminology that we expect everyone to know. I'm not going to be that way, but you might have other professors who will. So yes, good writing should include thought through grammar and ideas, but that's the end product. When you start writing and drafting, there's no reason for any of that to be perfect, and you don't have to be a grammar expert because we will use one another in peer review to help with grammar. You can use the writing tutors. I will give you feedback. So we don't have to be grammar experts. We just need to know what tools are available to us and people we can go to help with that, okay? Good grammar has nothing to do with good writing. Okay. The 5-paragraph essay, this is something a lot of us learn in school because it's just a good, easy formula. You have that good intro paragraph, you have 3 supporting paragraphs, and a conclusion. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with, maybe starting, if you have a 5-page paper or a 10-page paper, start with that 5 paragraphs. But know that it can't end there. You will have to go in and add more depth, more analysis, more detail. College writing usually expects more than just 5 paragraphs because the ideas require more space, okay? But that doesn't mean you should throw that 5-paragraph essay out the window. Just start there, but don't finish there. Okay, and then the never use I. This is one that I think so many of us are taught, especially in writing in high school. And there are going to be times when using the first person is just not appropriate, right? If you're writing a history paper about the Civil War, there's really no reason I can think of that you would use the first person and that would be some sort of effective use of voice, right? You weren't there, right? So, and your history professor likely doesn't want you to talk about yourself when the assignment is to write about some aspect of the Civil War, right? But in our class, a lot of times I'm asking you to write about your own experiences, or I'm saying it's okay to use the first person as long as you're not using it as a crutch. Some of you, I may have to give feedback and say, okay, every single one of these sentences begins with I. That's a problem because it becomes a crutch when we're writing, but feel free to utilize that first person if it is helping advance your ideas, or if I'm asking you to write about yourself, I certainly don't have the expectation that you're somehow going to write without using the first person, okay? But again, this is about asking your professors for those expectations, saying, do you allow the first person, in your different writing? But know that most college writing is going to say no first person, but you never know until you ask. All right, so those are just some of the basic ideas I wanted to cover just to make sure that we're on the same page when it comes to thinking about the writing. And please note that Irvin's article is going to come back this week in the discussion post, so you'll need to revisit some of the areas there as well. All right, y'all, we're flying through. We're in week 3 already, so hang in there.